You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're joined by Dr. Rebecca Landa, a leading expert in early autism detection and intervention. Dr. Landa is the founder of the Center for Autism Services, Science, and Innovation, otherwise known as CASSI, at Kennedy Krieger Institute, and has dedicated her career to identifying early signs of autism and developing effective interventions. Today, we'll discuss what early autism indicators look like, why early intervention is critical, and how parents, educators, and professionals can support children in their developmental journey. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Rebecca Landa.
Hello.
Well, I'm excited to have this opportunity to chat with you because you've been guiding the field for many years on some of these subjects and helping for a lot of clinicians, families, and schools to really explore different models of care, but also identifying children earlier and earlier to be able to access these cares and start on their developmental path, and helping them to really be empowered at an earlier age. But before we go into that, I'd love to hear what inspired your focus on early autism detection and intervention.
Thank you. Yes, when I was in graduate school, I studied brain sciences in addition to communication sciences and child development. And so when I finished that, I practiced clinically, and then I took a postdoc in autism and psychiatric genetics. And my mentors, Susan Folstein and Professor Sir Michael Rutter in England, had done the first epidemiologic twin study of autism. And they had found that identical twins, 90% of the time, both of the twins are autistic if one of them is. And then if they're fraternal twins or dizygotic twins, then it was more like 10% of the time. But then what happens in the co-twin in those situations is that usually they had other developmental challenges. And so the two of them had gotten this cross-national study where they were looking at the familiality or heritability of autism in families of children with autism compared to families of children with Down syndrome, so that you could look at the stressors of developmental disabilities on the family functioning. And so being a speech pathologist, when I would go into the homes of the families to do the testing of the parents and the individual who's autistic, the parents told me, my other child seems to be having some developmental challenges. So at that point, I started a line of research on siblings of autistic children. At the same time, I was doing brain research on teens who were autistic and looking at eye tracking and then vestibular ocular reflexes.
Mm-hmm.
And what I started to ask myself is, wait a minute, I've been told by my mentors that autism is autism at day one. And when the parents had been telling me that their child's autism characteristics didn't show up until like 1.5 years old, my mentors were like, Rebecca, they're wrong. They either missed it or they didn't have a neurotypically developing child to compare it to. So I just believed them.
Mm-hmm.
But when I started to study infancy, I wanted to get closer to birth so that I could understand what's coming into play first so that we could develop interventions and supports that would enable children to develop to their fullest. Not saying we're trying to eradicate autism. That's not the point. The point is, how do we help this child to, during this intense period of neuroplasticity, when the brain is developing its circuitry and its connections, there needs to be enrichment. And what if the child can't give that to themselves, right? So that's how I got into the infant early detection work.
And what is the overall value of being able to detect earlier? I mean, you get obviously to be able to start working with a child back at a time where their neuroplasticity allows for almost more remediation of some of the developmental skills. But what happens over time if you're not detecting it early enough?
Okay, so there's a phenomenon in developmental science, and it's called cascades, developmental cascades. And so that means that, let's just say that you know a certain amount of information, and that you can only learn the next thing once you know a certain amount of stuff, right? And
Hmm.
so, and if you don't know things, or you're not doing things to, like, help your caregiver know what you're interested in, so what they should be talking about to you, or if you're not sending signals to your caregiver that you're interested in interacting with them, you're kind of in some ways creating what kind of input your brain is getting. And so by detecting these early likelihood indicators of autism, we're able to help caregivers and parents know how to enrich the experiences of the infant so that the infant doesn't get stuck behind barriers um, that are not biologically necessarily there. I hope
Hmm.
I explained that adequately.
Yeah,
But
no,
yes,
you definitely did. And I think that what you're describing also, when I'm thinking through this as you're talking, it's almost like, if somebody isn't empowered with some of those skills to be able to kind of get to that next stage of wherever development would be bringing them, is that we probably create different ways of interacting with our environments or coping methodologies that maybe prevent us in the future or create blocks or barriers that then we have to try and figure out how to be able to solve around as individuals. Would that be pretty accurate?
it's perfectly well said. Yes.
So that makes it tough. And I mean, and maybe this is where autism treatment and what you're doing at CASSI kind of ties together, because autism treatment has typically been pretty siloed. It's been, well, I do this, I do that, I do this. But if you're identifying children at the age of 1, that's going to be very different treatment methodology than what I'd be doing at age 6 or even age 3. And so tell me about CASSI and kind of how you're looking at being able to identify early, and then also what that treatment path might look like, and what even that continuity of treatment might be.
Sure. Well, one piece of information that I'd like to share with your listeners is that autism does tend to run in families. Now, you can have a de novo mutation of a gene that means that no, it's just happened, right? Because during cell division, something just happened. But 20% of younger siblings of autistic children will develop autism. And another 30%, at least another 30%, will have some developmental challenges in social and communication development. So, knowing that if you have a child who's autistic, you want to be taking active steps with the younger one, both in terms of the way you're playing with them, talking to them, enriching their experiences, and in terms of developmental surveillance, keeping tabs of their development. And so in terms of what we do with treatment with a 1-year-old is we really want to depend heavily on learning sciences and developmental sciences. And what we do with any child is that we use this concept that people can Google. It's called serve and return. And so that is whatever the child's looking at, you name it. Or if they're playing with a fire truck, grab another vehicle and imitate what the child's doing. 100% chance, if you do these things, children are going to pay more attention to you. And that means they have greater bandwidth of engagement and attention. And that is, they're ripe for, this is a teachable moment, right? So it's, that's one of the principles. But we're also we very much acknowledge this concept called embodied cognition, which is basically means hands-on learning. Children are learning through their bodies. And so we want to increase their ability to think of new ways to playing with toys and interacting with people and using their bodies and learning to use their bodies to be in synchrony with other people, because when they're in synchrony with other people, they get more attention. Those are just some of the highlights. Is that what you were?
Yeah, no, I mean it's putting into context, I think for me is just understanding that, at age 1, if we're going to be screening and really identifying that we have that next layer is that there's an actionable item to it. And I think that you described it really well. And quite frankly, on serve and return, who doesn't like talking or engaging on objects or things that they care about? Which is what you're doing with that 1-year-old, is that you're making their world accessible to you and making yourself part of it, which is so critical. So let's get back to some of the components that we're talking about on these early signs, because I would imagine they have changed over time as far as our ability to detect them and our ability to identify, hey, you know what, these are some of the things that parents could be identifying at age 1 that maybe we weren't cued into in the past. Are there signs that you'd be saying to families, hey, you know what, if you're seeing this, this is a good thing to talk with your doctor about. This is a good thing to talk to a specialist about, just to be able to start that conversation?
Yes. And all of these things that I'm talking about are emerging in like 8, 9, 10, 11-month olds. So if you don't see them in a child at their first birthday or at age 14 months, this is to take your advice. Go talk to your primary care provider. So some of them are imitating. Children imitate other people. And so you want to see that spontaneous imitation. You want to see children showing you something that's of interest to them. So they might hold up a ball. They might point to something. They might do what we call a triadic gaze shift, where they look over at something and look back at you and then look over at the thing. That's called initiation of joint attention. Responding to their name is another big one. Being able to take turns back and forth. So these are things that, if you're not seeing them, could be indicators that autism could be beginning to come on the scene.
Yeah. And I mean, as a parent, these are probably things that you're looking for anyways, because with a young child, you just want that chance to be able to make that connection. You want that's what keeps us all going intrinsically, is having that one-to-one interpersonal connection with our children. So it sounds like something that if you're not seeing, you're probably feeling anyways. And it's good to talk with somebody to rule things out nonetheless, or to at least have some guidance where to go forward. But there are other ways that you're looking at for early detection. And I know that is it the early video guided autism risk screener that you all are using right now?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one that we use here in-house, and it goes from 12 months to the 5th birthday. But we have a new one that is a first cousin of that, that's just on 1 and 2-year-olds, and it's called the Social Communication Interaction and Play Screener, or SCIPS. And people can search on SCIPS and then Kennedy Krieger Institute, and Krieger is Krieger. Because we are actually doing a study right now where families anywhere in the United States can participate to help us know where the cut points are for different ages. And so we need 2,000 children who are 1 and 2 years old, whether you have concerns or you don't have concerns. So that way we can help families know if children are developing as expected at their age. And I'd like to just say a couple of things about this that make it so special. One of the barriers to screening is that, we don't have great screeners for 1 and 2-year-olds out there. Number 2, we want a screener that can do more than screen for autism only, because there's lots of other things that fall into this space, like a language delay or delay in play development, things like that. And so this screener takes care of that. And then also parents need a visual. And so in this screener, you see short video clips of children who are neurotypically developing and who are showing signs of autism or other delays. And they're narrated so that you can see exactly what you should be looking at. And then after you see those videos, you answer questions about your child while those images are fresh in your mind.
Yeah, I think that's so valuable. I think that, I mean, we don't know what we don't know. And especially if it's our first child, it's,
Mhm.
what are your expectations? What are you seeing? And and it's tough to say what should my child, but what is it that I would be expecting my child at specific ages to start engaging with on a regular basis? And having that video reference is extremely valuable. So, I mean, now you have the ability to start looking for earlier signs. You're helping to educate families on that piece. And there's a tool that you're looking at as well to be able to help really start to put this picture into the family's mind and give them that comparative sample. When somebody is needing treatment at that age of 1, I would imagine that that parental component is the most important piece to a treatment model, because not only are you working with the child and their interpersonal connection, which is with their parent at that point of age, but you're helping the parent. So is this all teaching a teacher almost thought process of how I'm going to actually start an intervention at that age?
It is. And I think one of the most important things for parents to think about is to always let your child know that they are wonderful just as they are. And because those messages that you send through your touch, the tone of your voice, the language that you use with your child, what you do when they don't respond, and what you do when they respond in a way that wasn't what you were expecting, or if they're having a meltdown, those things, that energy that you put out with all that will stay with them a lifetime. And you want them to grow up no matter what where they are on the spectrum, or what their intellectual abilities are, or how verbal they are, knowing in their being that they are wonderful.
Mhm.
That's my biggest message I want to send out to the parents.
Absolutely. And I mean, when we look at any sort of child out there, is that any healthy child is going to feel some level of esteem about themselves
Mhm.
and about their place in the world. As far as, where I'm at right now, I should be proud of who I am. And and us as parents, we should be proud of our children and what they're accomplishing. And that's regardless of where they are on any sort of developmental skill set. It's a matter of, this is their personality and who they can be. Treatment, I would imagine, in your point of view, would be just more about empowering that child to be able to kind of engage in what they want to do next, and to be able to accomplish all their goals versus changing them. Is that kind of how you view
Well,
treatment?
so let me just say this. That's foundational.
Hmm.
That's sort of the macro, right? And then what we want parents to do is to learn some specific strategies that are principles
Hmm.
for their engagement with their child. Like, name what your child's looking at and touching. Expand, copy what your child's doing and expand it. Let your child create opportunities for your child to initiate. We don't want kids just to be responders and become automatons. We
Hmm.
want them to be actively thinking and finding new ways to explore with toys. And I think another thing that we really help parents learn is what toys to pick for their child, because that's an easy trap for parents to fall into, to buy the cause effect toys and not to understand their child's developmental play levels.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, just every step of that process probably chips away at, just, how you're enriching the environment and how you're creating a safe place for your child to be able to explore and start to develop those relationships. Does that change over time? Because you've done a lot of work as somebody is developing through their lifespan. And initially, it's that parent-child relationship and building trust and everything that's so important. But as the child moves on in their developmental trajectory, I would imagine treatment changes, who's part of their treatment plan and who's part of their environment in general changes. Like, now have siblings or friends or classmates. So what do you see as far as helping for that transition from step to step? Is there Is there a role for preschools and for schools to be empowered with some of these clinical treatments that are out there to be able to kind of say, how do I enrich the child's experience with these?
Yes, and you're right, because we always have to be anticipating what the child is going to need to be able to do next. And so not all, most children will be in school at some point. The earlier we can get them used to being with peers, interacting with peers, learning to be comfortable in the space with other children, the different kinds of sounds that happen there, and learning how to initiate with peers, learning how to follow the peers' lead, because not everybody's always going to follow your lead.
Mhm.
Learning how to sit during circle time, whether it's on a rocking chair, a beanbag, whether it's on a squishy cushion, or whether maybe they just stand up for a little while. Uh, all of that is critical. So we have a group-based intervention program here that we start kids in as early as like 22 months of age, just before their second birthday. And then they can be in this program until they turn 6. And what schools tell us is that they can tell the difference between kids who've come through this program and any other program. Now, mind
Mm.
you, our program is only a couple of hours a day because we want them in their community settings for the other part of the day.
Yeah. And I mean, and that group base, like you said, is that a child's world changes over
Mhm.
time. And you have to be able to change the environment that they're learning in as you're helping them through those processes. I love the idea of being able to kind of move with the child through their journey and make sure that you're creating the right environment at all times. I everything that you've been working on, I think, is so amazing as far as it's trying to be able to kind of link so many different treatment modalities together. What what are the influences that are guiding this process that you all are looking at as far as some of the clinical influences that are helping you to kind of look at the lifespan process of treatment?
Are you thinking about from intervention principles
I think
or?
so. I think from intervention principles, some of the influences that are combined in a treatment methodology that sometimes are isolated and people say, I only do this, where, there is overlap to a lot of these principles and how to apply them.
You have to have multiple tools in your toolbox, and those tools need to be evidence-based. In other words, they have to be sharp, and
Mhm.
you have to be able to pull them out and use them with, like, you're going to use a Phillips head screwdriver with certain screws and not with other screws. And learning is the same. And so one of the key principles, and this comes from applied behavior analysis, is developmentally appropriate and clear cues. If you don't know what you want the child to do, the child surely doesn't know what you want them to do. And then that if you need to know what to expect, and then if the child isn't giving you what you were expecting, then you have to evaluate. Was my Am I expecting more than is fair under the circumstances here? And be prepared to deliver the appropriate prompts and then to reward attempts. Like, that's the ABC sequence, the
Mhm.
antecedent behavior consequence sequence. But then every person, I don't care if they're 17 or if they're 7 or 7 months, has to have something in it for them. They have to be motivated. And so there's many ways to motivate, including incorporating their interests, letting them make choices, um, uh, and making sure that they get to have a say in how long the activity is. So, I mean, this is a partnership with
Mhm.
kids.
Yeah. And we all do better with partnerships. If we don't have a voice in what we're doing or some level of autonomy, and no matter what stage of life, is that it creates almost a friction, like this battle of control, which of course you don't want. You want somebody wanting to be a part of your experience and journey with you, and not a force factor of saying you have to. I'm pushing you to have to be a part of this. And I think what you're describing is just good treatment. I think it's just looking at all those angles. So where can folks find more information about the research and about the interventions and about the resources that you all provide at CASSI?
If they would go to CASSI, CASSI, And then I don't know how Kennedy Krieger has structured it in the toolbar of Google, but if they just put in CASSI and they put in Kennedy Krieger, they're going to come to our landing site. And the same with SCIPS. If they put in SCIPS, SCIPS, and Kennedy Krieger, they'll come up to the SCIPS landing site. And if worst comes to worst, they can Google my name, Rebecca Landa, and lots of stuff will come up.
Yeah, I definitely encourage our listeners, if they have children that are young that would benefit from being a part of that research project, is that being involved in something like SCIPS helps so many other children, because it's a learning opportunity through research to be able to know how these products work, how to be able to improve upon them and make it so that they become available to the masses, which would be amazing. But thank you so much, Dr. Landa, for your time today. And once again, I feel like I always learn just by being a part of the show, but this is another experience I think I truly appreciate.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.